Everybody, welcome back to our second session for the day. Again, I'm Carl Matheson. I'm Politico's senior climate correspondent. We have an audience in the room, packed and bustling and ready to hear our speakers. And also online, welcome to all of you. I am going to open up this panel with, I guess, we're going to focus on COP27 and the negotiators who I'm joined by, who might just have about recovered from a really tough few days that involve little sleep and difficult negotiations. Before we get into our panel discussion, the question of the success or failure of this COP has sort of been rumbling on social media for a few days. And before we ask our esteemed panel what they think, I actually wanted to get a sense from the room about where you saw COP27. You've all been given paddles that you're sitting next to with a red face and a white face. And just purely, and you know, we're not taking notes or anything like that, but purely for an experiment, I'd like if you could just hold up the red face if you think COP27 was a failure, and the white face if you think COP27 was a success. Wow, okay, it's pretty unanimous for those online. I actually don't think I saw a white face. So that's a really interesting place to start. I just wanted to use that because COPs don't readily boil down to this kind of success or failure binary, but this really has been, to me, one of the debates that's played out since we finished the meeting late last Sunday. Many Europeans felt quite downbeat as the deal in Egypt failed to move the world forward on commitments on cutting emissions that they'd made the year before in Glasgow. But many developing countries hailed a huge and unexpected win with the creation of a fund for loss and damage, which is the UN term that includes finance to help communities rebuild after being damaged by climate change. So as they say, where you stand depends on where you sit. To discuss that and what comes next, please welcome Jacob Worksman, who is one of the chief advisors for the European Commission on international climate change. We've got, sorry, I'm just pushing through my notes. We were meant to be joined by Teresa Ribera, the Vice President of Spain, but she has sent Valverna Uligari, her Director General for Climate Change, in her place. Faten Agad from the African Climate Foundation, and Pascal Canfin joins us online. He's an MEP with the Renew Group. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I wanted to start by asking, well, Valverna, if you could just talk. Teresa Ribera expressed some disappointment coming out of COP27, and I wanted to get a sense, obviously you can't speak for her directly and her sense of disappointment, but in general, why that was a sentiment that was shared by many Europeans coming out of the talks.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure being with you this afternoon. Yes, I think that the sentiment was bittersweet, was with light and shadows. Depends on how you want to see the package, because at the end of the day, no, this is a package. I think that was a very good package for climate justice, and it's important that the international community and even though the complex situations we live in gave a clear signal on solidarity and more even after the COVID vaccine crisis. So I think that this part of the deal, was very welcome, and the Europeans play a very important role there. And I think that we should be happy about opening this new agenda of solidarity that is necessary, not only on the climate agenda and not only within the convention, but also outside the convention. This fund, that is the milestone, the more significant piece, is not the more relevant one, and this is the other part of the argument. The more relevant issue here, the more relevant result is the call to reform the institutional global framework. I think that if we want to move through a ecological transition, or real ecological or real energy transition model, we don't need to move, all the trillions, 4 to 6, or however the big amounts will be, changing the structures of the financial system. Otherwise, it will be not possible. And this is also very positive. So the solidarity agenda, looking ahead and looking, outside the convention, and saying, how positive, will be if the multilateral banks, the financial institutions, make a real step forward, and look with new lens, how to work in the spring and in the autumn's meetings will be, very, 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 very good result. And the big shadow is that we don't understand, and we were not able to push enough to put the mitigation ambition on top of all of that. That is the real cause of the climate change crisis. So, as I said at the beginning, bittersweet, very, very, very good for climate justice, and even more better for the call to reform, our structure to how to finance, national and international, and also, a big sad or a big deception, that we are not able, to make a step forward from Glasgow to Egypt, and that's the challenge that we have in front of us.
We're going to hear the word mitigation a lot, I think, in this panel, which is essentially, it's kind of UN climate parlance for cutting emissions for our audience. Fateh Nagard, how do you see the outcome of COP27, and particularly, I guess, the focus coming out of it on this mitigation disappointment that has kind of bubbled away since?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I would align with the points of the previous speaker, in the sense that there was something for some and not, perhaps arguably not for others, and I'll come back to that point. I think, sitting from where we sit, the establishment of the fund with few caveats. I mean, let's see how it's going to be resourced. Let's see the details in the lead up to COP28, because I think the devil will be in the details of how that will be structured. But as such, for those of us who have a history being involved in negotiations, the fact that there is that acquis on which we can build and negotiate a way forward is extremely positive. We weren't able to do that for the last 3 decades. Having said that, and I mean, we hear a lot about mitigation, and I want to be challenging here. The argument around the COP that, in my opinion, tried to hijack to some degree the entire discussion. I think let us perhaps take a step back and look at where most responsibility for action actually sits. I think there's a lot that could be done and said at the COP. There's, understandably, everybody wants to say the right things, etc. But what we look at is action. Action in terms of what measures are being taken to reduce emissions. Just noting, by the way, that neither the EU nor the US are on track at the moment to meet the 1.5 degree target. And the question is, and I think it's there where our focus needs to be, what is being concretely done by the high emitters to actually help the world reach the target? Because from where we sit, the responsibility there is very clear. And we'd like to see more action and a bit more leadership in that respect.
Pascal Canfin, I know that you can only join us for a limited time during this discussion, so I wanted to bring you in for a couple of questions. Maybe in response to this, in a way, if the onus remains on the EU, do you agree with that? I mean, the Parliament has called for stronger targets from the European Union, so does the European Union actually need to step up both on its own targets, but then also on delivery, on climate finance, on many of these aspects. Then how can that be engineered in the coming year?
So, hello and good afternoon to all. First, I would say that the EU was among a very limited number of players that have raised the bar of their 2030 NDC compared to Glasgow. And it is exactly the sense of the climate package we are negotiating, and we negotiated enough before Sharm el-Sheikh to be able to say, and Frans Timmermans officially said it at the COP27, that the EU's objective NDC for 2030 is now 57% instead of 55%, because what we have negotiated so far allows us to say so. I haven't seen that move from other big emitters. You would say, fine, 55, 57, what's the difference? Well, it's the difference of an entire country's emissions, like Austria or Portugal. So it's not nothing when it comes to the size of emissions, additional reductions emissions. Second, I think the EU was right to say in Sharm that, okay, to go for a loss and damage facility or fund. I know it's a very sensitive question, fine, but, and it's a big but legitimate but, only if the donor-based, as we say, is broadened to countries. Obviously, the elephant is in the room is China, because there is no reason why today, for setting up new facilities, China should be out of the scope of donors when we look at the emissions figures. Third, and that will be my last message here. Third, please do not limit the action or the climate intentional action to the UN negotiation. Let's take very concrete example. Trade rules. We are now negotiating at the EU level a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and Al Gore a few minutes ago referred to that. We are the first in the world to do so. It will change rules in trade with our big partners, and it will have an impact beyond our borders. Second, we are doing the same, meaning injecting climate and biodiversity in trade rules for the fight against deforestation in primary forests, such as in Indonesia or in Brazil. And we are this week negotiating the final round for the first ever law on imported deforestation. It is not negotiated within the UN framework. It is legal pieces from the Green Deal that will have an impact globally. That's where the EU drives the change as well, way beyond the UN framework for climate negotiation.
I think we'll all be grateful if it's not contained completely to the discussion on climate change is not contained completely to COPs, because we're all exhausted by them. But Jake Worksman, Mr. Khalfan spoke about the language around expanding the donor base for the loss and damage fund. There was another piece of language that the EU insisted on, and that was that this money goes to particularly vulnerable. Those are the two words that you really try to insert in a kind of last minute late night discussion, or during the day. I can't remember if it was day or night, but I'm really curious about what you think that means. Who's particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I mean, I think we said at the outset of COP27, which we've all walked away with a bit of disappointment about, that our expectations were around urgency. We wanted to see more drive for emissions reductions, building on the momentum that we managed to achieve in Glasgow. We wanted to see solidarity, and the example given by others as the achievement of this commitment to find a new financial funding arrangement for loss and damage was that second part. And then thirdly, we wanted to achieve more of a sense that we were affecting the system beyond the UNFCCC negotiating process. And I think on the question that you asked of why it is that we feel more comfortable with the outcome on the funding arrangements than was being asked by the developing countries as a bloc, is that it focuses on the particularly vulnerable countries. And that's one of the ways in which we feel that we can have an effect on the system. The system, as originally designed in 1992, divides the world into basically two camps. The developed countries, which are expected to pay for everything, developed as defined in 1992, and the developing countries, which are expected to be eligible for all support derived from the regime, again as defined in 1992. And so for us to be able to support the establishment of a new funding arrangement, which will have a fund as a part of it, we wanted to have this new establishment recognize that as a priority, we have to reach the particularly vulnerable. It's still for the negotiators to work on what that means. For us, I think it means setting a priority that really does focus on the countries that are recognized as vulnerable from both a physical and economic point of view, but also takes into account vulnerable communities in countries that might have capacities as a whole that might describe them as middle income in nature. But addressing that particular category of country does require a change from the 1992 system. So when I hear colleagues on the panel say, we have to acknowledge where the responsibility lies, I hope that is where the responsibility lies today as we try to tackle the problem that we're faced with today, and not responsibility as defined in 1992, where the world looked very different in many different ways.
Faten, again, that wasn't how the developing countries wanted to define this fund. The group, the bloc of 134 developing countries, actually pushed for this traditional divide. Where do you think the dividing line is going to, because we're going to enter, for context, we're going to enter a year of negotiations now around how to design this fund. So where is the developing country bloc on this language of particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, first I'd just like to say that we shouldn't conflate issues. I think, a lot has been said within the framework of the negotiations on the separation between loss and damage and adaptation. And the developing world, at least in Africa for sure, we've been very clear in terms of the need to separate the two. So the funding arrangement for loss and damage, to go back to the point on where responsibility lies, I think the responsibility with respect to adaptation is a collective responsibility. I think nobody challenges that. It's a responsibility that is, by the way, also shouldered by, if I take African countries, it's also a responsibility shouldered by African countries. They're putting 9 to 15% of their GDP today just to, in fact, to respond even to loss and damage. Other partners, I think, to go back to the elephant in the room, China is investing heavily in Africa. It's the biggest investor in African green infrastructure as we stand today. And so I think as we move forward, I think I fully agree. I think it's our common responsibility. The problem with loss and damage is that this has already occurred. It's happening based on historical emissions. And I think the data there is extremely clear. I think attempts to hijack the discussion around the fund for geopolitical reasons, and I'm sorry to say it, is highly problematic. So I think we need to stay focused on that, just perhaps on the point of vulnerability. And I agree. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of the negotiators unpacking and defining that. The risk, at least as some of the countries are seeing from the African side, is that it will end up being a low-income country, maybe a V20 kind of construct versus the rest. The truth is that we do have middle-income African countries that are already suffering from the impact of climate change. The big question is, would these fall under the vulnerable category or not? I think if the concern is China, I think there are clauses that could be added. We've done it under the WTO, where an exception has been included to even mention which countries are not eligible to tap into. I'm talking about the TRIPS waiver precedent that we had, that that at least in the draft proposal, in fact, that came from the EU, there was a very clear specification excluding specific countries, if that's the concern, from eligibility. And I think that could be replicated without necessarily giving a sense or worrying countries for that they may or may not. And we've seen it in Pakistan, with Pakistan, for instance, also already expressing concerns, and rightly so. So I just want to say, let us not conflate the issues and be very clear as to where the lines lie.
Valvanira Vlagui, I wanted to, I guess, get your sense, maybe in response to that, like, do you have a list of countries that you think should be on such an exemption from this fund? And also I wanted to ask you another really specific question, which is, have you as a government discussed how much you might pay into this fund and what collectively would be a good global goal for donating into this?
Thank you very much. I would like to elaborate a little bit on previous ideas, and I will try to respond to these tricky questions that you have put on the table. On vulnerability, not vulnerability, I think that is important. Don't to miss the full picture, but don't to miss the full picture in the dynamics of the negotiations, and I think that Jake pointed out very well. When we came to COP27 and when we came with the willingness not to respond to this new challenging agenda of loss and damage, we thought that the best option is to tackle from a broadened perspective, not only for a little arrangement or financial arrangements. We also realized that the demand by vulnerables and by developing countries were very important for them for this COP, and we also realized that they wanted to have the fund at all costs because they missed to work in the whole package in the last days of the negotiation. So that gave us a flavor of how we can react as European Union and how can we react to help to have a good success on the agenda of solidarity. But our perspective and our best options to deal with that is to work in the full picture. The full picture, as I said at the beginning, in the different levels. The full picture about the whole loss and agenda items. That means that we need to work first on mitigation to try to revert and to minimize. Second, on adaptation, that it's fundamental for all countries, but especially for the ones that are suffering more impacts right now, and then to respond to the losses and damage when we have already occurred. So this needs to be understood in the whole picture. So the elements that we work in, and I came to and I will elaborate on the questions. A specific question is how we are going to identify the real needs, and here we have the Santiago network that was already put in place. That was also a good result of the COP. How we are going, to reconduct the money to make a real adaptation economy in the whole world, and especially in the developing countries, and then how we are going, to put funds on this new instrument. If we are not able, as I said at the beginning, to change the structures and the pillars of the international system, it will be very complicated because we need to change also, the debt rules. We need to change, the vulnerability variables when we are making grants to developing countries. So we need to work on the agenda, this year, and we need to work, as was mentioned, especially outside the convention, but having this hook and this important political milestone that we agree at COP27. So yes, we have already talked about how to help on the agenda, how to put more governance and more resources on the agenda. The Spanish perspective from the very beginning was to be proactive and helpful to make, you know, to make the step forward and to open this new space. And what about the money and what about the dollars that we need to put there? We need to have the broader picture, you know, more fixed in order to really make efficient contributions to the problem and in all the different phases of the loss and damage agenda. We have already announced funds for the Santiago network that was established. We have already announced, the President announced also funds for the early warning systems. We really think that it's very, very helpful infrastructure that would help to prevent losses and damage, and that would help to make the good economic decisions. And we also would like to help, you know, in the new fund when we know, you know, exactly, you know, how it's going to be operationalized. But it's important that we don't only concentrate the debate on how much money or how less money will be on this fund, because otherwise we will not reach, you know, the whole agenda that we need to elaborate in the coming months.
Having said that, I do think we need some guidance on roughly how much money should be expected to move into this fund, because I assume it has to be a meaningful amount, and I'm wondering what you would think is a meaningful amount, Faten Agad, in terms of meeting what's been estimated to be around $100 billion a year in loss and damage from climate change right now, and only growing. So where is the anticipated level of funding just for this fund, which, it should be said, is also part of a much larger group of mechanisms and other ways to address this issue, but obviously it's a politically important one.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the amount matters. I think you mentioned the figures there, and I think there will be some space to even negotiate, provided the quality of the finance is right. I would agree with the point that you know, the role of how the finance is provided is extremely important. Whether it is whether the fund will enable grant resources, or if there's a shift to the international financial system, the concern is that that will also come with its own set of issues. Are we talking about then, you know, the World Bank providing money in the form of loans, which would be problematic? So I think I would say it's really the balance. It's the balance between the right amount that covers closely the current costs, without undermining, by the way, the adaptation financing, because that really remains a very central piece, and it's there, I think, where the big game changer will be. But I think at least to regain trust in this multilateral process, we do need to have serious money as close as possible to, if I take African countries, to this 9% GDP cost as possible, plus very good quality finance.
That's billions that we're talking, Jake. Is that, I mean, the EU kind of almost, you know, proposed this alternative, or broke the stasis in the talks by coming forward with its own suggestions. So this is a bit on you guys. You must have had an idea of how much you would then be called on to put in.
Yeah, well, I think you have to look carefully at what the EU proposed. I mean, we agreed that we would join a consensus in establishing a fund, but in the context of a much broader new funding arrangement. And I think we continue to believe that what you're after is billions. You have to look where the billions are currently flowing in supporting developing countries, dealing with a whole range of different challenges. And I think this is to reinforce the point that Valvanera was making. When you actually listen to the kinds of needs that developing countries are expressing, they come in a great variety. I mean, they come from, even within the small island states, from the needs expressed by middle-income countries that are experiencing extreme weather events and actually want more fiscal space to be able to borrow money on reasonable terms. They actually want loans, because it's a very important part of the structure of their whole economic system, in order to help them to rebuild. On the other end of the spectrum, still remaining within the small island grouping, you have low-lying Pacific countries that are worried about sea level rise and the impact that that's having on their culture, on their ability to produce certain traditional crops, et cetera. That feels like it needs much more of a traditional development assistance grant-based approach. And within that existing landscape of institutions, you have already billions of dollars flowing, whether it's through the IMF, it's through the World Bank, it's through the World Food Program, it's through the GCF that was set up 10 or more years ago to support the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that's where I think donors are more likely to be able to ramp up more billions more quickly than in a fund that still has yet to be designed and has yet to gain the confidence of any investors that it's going to be able to fill any particular gap in the system. So we're going to continue to push for the strengthening of that existing system while the process that we launched in Sharm el-Sheikh explores where the gaps are and tries to discover what gaps this new fund could best fill.
I wanted to just finish, I guess, to process or to think about the year ahead in sort of 30 seconds, Fatan Agad. I just wanted to ask you, what will the kind of red lines for developing countries do you think be as this fund gets negotiated?
That we see developed countries retracting. In a sense that we see, arguments such as there is money already there. I think showing that there is commitment, there will be follow-up to the commitment to keep credibility. And to me, this is really about, are we serious about sustaining trust in this multilateral system, or will each region go its own way? And we can't afford that if we are serious about sorting out the climate change issue.
We have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This is a really interesting discussion, and I know that we're going to be following this really closely at Politico, because it's an international climate negotiation that runs all year long, and it's going to be definitely something that we're going to be watching. It's obviously hugely interesting also for the US. So lots to discuss, lots to go on with, but please just join me in thanking our panel. We're going to now cross to an interview that I recorded earlier with Mohamed Nasser, who's the lead negotiator for the Egyptian COP27 presidency. We're going to first have, I'm told we're going to have a break first, and then we're going to go to an interview. So have a rest and then come back. Oh, you're saying stay seated, Agat? Stay seated. Okay, please stay seated. We do what Agat says. Thank you.